Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Denes Boros. I'm back again with Insane in the Endgame, and today we are going to do something special. We are going to take a look at a game not from your favorite time period, but the favorite time period of Pillsbury, because he was alive then. Now, Pillsbury had a match versus Showalter. Showalter was a decent player, but not such a great one as Pillsbury, because everybody knows what Pillsbury is famous about and for. Now, before I get into the nitty-gritty, we are going to be focusing on a specific position of the Carlsbad structure. And the reason, as I get to that position, we are focusing on this one. Oftentimes, it wouldn't be, strictly speaking, an endgame, more of a heavy piece endgame, which is a bit more complicated than your usual simple rook endgames and your endgames, so to say. In this case, oftentimes it's all about the controls and the pawn structures. So as the pawn structures come alive and come to being, you realize that here your main goal is to undermine your opponent's structure. So the next move isn't really shocking from Harry Nelson Pillsbury. He jumps right on in with knight e5. And what makes knight e5 special? Well, it's a novel idea at the times and also was very successfully played by Pillsbury. Therefore, that is that knight, what we call the Pillsbury knight. Now, Showalter didn't know that he has something to show, but he knew that he didn't want that knight to station there for long. So knight g4, guess what? We are going for mass trades. But as you'll notice, even though we'll get mass trades of the light pieces, there'll be still ample play for Pillsbury to play for. So bishop takes, queen takes, knight takes, bishop takes g4. So the first thing and most important thing, when you're playing a heavy middle game, middle game / endgame, you still have to decide the direction where you're going. You can always fall back to the classic way of going with the Carlsbad minority attack, but there are other ways. And in this case, Pillsbury chooses another one. He goes for rook ae1. He is preparing the idea of f3 and e4. Now, for one thing, f3 was impossible because of the threat of queen takes e3. But after rook ae1, f3 will be on the agenda and e4 would give a big advantage. For example, if h6, these pawns would start rolling non-stop. So Showalter realizes, and in fact, kudos for Showalter, who is not as well known of a player than Pillsbury himself. You'd notice that he anticipates his well-known opponent's ideas. So the very next question is what to do to stop f3 and e4. And this is kind of important. When you can anticipate these plans, that's the moment you can tell you've reached a very high level in your chess. So once f3 and e4 shows up, there is imminent trades on e4 and f takes e4. And once those trades happen, then there is a pawn that becomes extremely weakened. And that is the d4 pawn. So in this scenario, Showalter decides to go queen f6, with the idea of eyeing the d pawn, stopping Pillsbury from rolling those pawns in the center. Now, if you're unfamiliar with these middle game / endgame structures, often if white gets that e and d pawns rolling, there is no stopping those, and white has a crushing positional advantage. And that sort of means if f3, e4 is out the window, you've got to look for a brand new plan. So let's start thinking about this. What can Pillsbury lean back on, if not on the f3, e4 idea? As we mentioned, there is threats on the d pawn that would be troublesome. So whenever you're trying to figure out these pawn structures and how you can attack them, you always first have to find the weakest link. Now, it's not the most popular game in the TV shows, but it was at some moment. And if you can spot it, then you know the direction what white should be going for. If you look at these pawns, they're very difficult to deal with. That pawn is defended by the Larsen knight. Larsen used to say, if you get a knight on f8, there is no fear for checkmate, and there is nothing that you have to worry about in this scenario. Knight on f8, no checkmate. Bent Larsen, one of the best players, and also the player who Bobby Fischer himself said, well, I could play number 1 on Team World, but I'm going to give that spot to Bent, the Prince of Dane. So we really don't have any weaknesses in this case. On the black side of things, f7, g7, h7, all well defended. So if you look at this position, what would be a potential target for Pillsbury to latch onto? So it can't really be the d pawn. Can't be the c pawn, because they're all defending each other. So that cannot be the answer. The biggest weakness in this position is the b7 pawn. The weakest link of this whole pawn chain. And this will be crucial in all the games that we're going to take a look at. That classic minority attack comes into fruition. But here Pillsbury plays something that is not the usual way. Everybody goes b4, runs it down with a4. But b4 is showing your intentions immediately. In these type of positions, black can often go queen d6, a4. Well, not necessarily a4 because that would drop the pawn, but let's say queen b3, rook d8, a3, a5. This is a typical idea undermining this structure. b5, and now black could go c5, relieving the pressure on that b7 pawn. And yes, there will be a weakness on d5, but that's compensated by these loose pawns by white as well. So when Pillsbury was deciding which way to continue on with his minority attack, he probably envisioned that b4 entails some risks of this a5, b5, and c5 plan. So he went for a4. And what makes a4 such a great move, it does not show white's hand. Also, it threatens to gain space. You could try to fix that b pawn, and maybe even an eventual queen b3 will put pressure on the b pawn there. a4, rook e7, b4. And this is kind of the nuance and shows how big of a talent Pillsbury was. He knew that he wants to go for the minority attack, but didn't want to give away his intentions. b4, rook e8, b5. And we get the typical idea. Black can rarely take on b5 because that would leave the d5 pawn chronically weak. queen g5. So, in general, if you're attacking, that's a good thing. But you have to figure out what Showalter is on about. So let's take a look. What could Showalter be planning to do in this position? And Pillsbury is pretty quick to react to it. So there is obviously the idea of bishop h3. Is that the only threat that black is threatening? In fact, black has multiple threats, not just bishop h3. So bishop h3 is a great move, but let's say white is oblivious to black's plans. If you go bishop h3, I can go f4. And not only do I attack your queen, if your queen moves anywhere towards square, it's gonna get captured. And queen g4 stops it, but after king h1, that bishop is gonna get captured. And that is not something that black would want to have. So exactly right, Bjorn. Bishop f3 is the bigger threat, blocking in the f-pawn. And now g3 is forced, but then we have these typical queen h5, queen h3, and queen g2 checkmates. So this is very dangerous. Now Pillsbury senses the danger, and also it's in his style. He lashes out with f4, chases the queen away, but does create a potential weakness on e3. Queen f6, queen d2, bishop f5. So in these type of Carlsbad structures, the pawns are the heart and soul. So the question is, how can Nelson Pillsbury continue on from this position? Is there any threats that he has to deal with right now? And I understand it's somewhat subjective. Some feel a move is threatening and others don't. But that is the subjective nature of chess. And believe it or not, even computers understand that there are moves that have the equal value. So subjectivity is objective in this game. So the question is if there's any threat on e3. As far as I can tell, it's nothing too strong. We've got the queen and rook defending it. So it seems to me that we have it all under control. So first step, what you take in a position like this is realizing if there is a high red alert in your position, and if not, you continue on with your plans. So we are doing good. Let's continue on with our plans. How can we undermine Showalter's position in that case? Well, we realized that this pawn by itself won't necessarily win the game. Like if they take, of course they're never gonna take with the queen. They're gonna take with the pawn. You don't have enough pressure on the d5 pawn. Yes, you see This is becoming the next weakest link, but even if you would try to double up on the c file, going after that c pawn, that ain't gonna work out in your favor because the e3 pawn is loose and is very hard to deal with. But if you go rook f3, I'm not quite sure what you're aiming to do in that case. Well, you do relieve that rook on e1. But just bringing the rook to c1 or b1 will not turn the tide in this game. So what Pillsbury did is he played a5 with the specific idea of going after the weakest link. So Pillsbury actually does the purest of the pure minority attack in the Carlsbad. He just gets rid of that b pawn, and once that is gone, Showalter's chances in an endgame is dissipating. So let's see what happens. Queen g6, takes, a6. And this is big success by white. You are going to trade these b and c pawns off, leaving the d pawn weak. Now, of course, there is the c pawn that we have to tend to, but from a strategical perspective, Showalter is in trouble. So c takes b5, knight takes b5, queen d7. So Showalter is fighting back. He's trying to shoo our knight away. But he is to wake up to a rude awakening. It is white to move and come up with a splendid idea. So we succeeded from a positional standpoint, but that does not mean we can't use some form of witchcraft, tactics, in these cases. And Pillsbury does not shy away from tactics if it's possible. So his next move is somewhat surprising, but not so much if you have honed your tactical skills. Now, if white would go knight c3, there is this idea of b5, and even though there's this d pawn weakness, then eventually that b pawn can become a menace, and they can also gang up on the a pawn. So in this scenario, Pillsbury came up with the spectacular move of a takes b7, which goes to show, even in the driest of dry positions, there could be some tactical sequences you can use. A takes b7. Obviously, you can't directly capture back because of knight d6 and you lose the exchange. And of course, the big question is what happens in case of queen takes b5. Rook b1. The rooks come in there in time. And the fact is, black had all that pressure on the b pawn. But in this case, the queen will have to move away, otherwise it's taken. And now I can promote, takes, and that is just a winning position. So here, Showalter had to go a6, chase the knight away. Still a very good move, knight c3. Always closer to the center, trying to press the d pawn. Queen takes b7, and a rook b1. Queen c6. Now, it's time for us to take a look and assess the position. We got this typical pawn structure of the Carlsbad, but with a big difference of black not having this pawn chain and Pillsbury already committing his pawn to f4. Now, it's obvious to the eye that this f-pawn is not a happy camper. It rather want to be on f2, but in chess, pawns don't move backwards, sadly. Now, here, again, Pillsbury comes up with a very creative idea of defending the e-pawn without defending it. And again, it shows that Pillsbury was quite a talented player. By the way, in the long run, it's still beneficial and more pleasant for white because black has two weaknesses, both of them isolated, while white only has one pawn on e3 that he needs to take care of. So whenever you're looking for these tactical solutions, always try to pinpoint the loosest or the weakest piece your opponent has. So what is the loosest piece in Showalter's position? Which piece in black's position is a little bit loose? The queen, yes. The queen is a little bit loose. So here Pillsbury uses a very nice tactical idea. Goes rook fc1. Now Showalter wasn't interested, but we are. And we're curious what's wrong with rook takes e3. There is a reason why this hasn't been played. And quite a convincing reason, let me tell you that. It has to be a knight move, obviously. Otherwise, how are we going to use the power of that rook? Knight e4. I saw many of you were saying knight d1, but knight d1 there's rook e1 check. If you take, I take with a check, and that is sad news. So takes. Your king is under attack. You don't have time to take my queen. And if you don't take, I chasse away with my majesty, and you're the one who's losing. However, in this case, white has a splendid tactical idea of knight e4, blocking the connection between the rooks and attacking the queen. So either you move the queen away, then I take your rook, or you capture that knight, but then I take your queen. So knight e4 is a unique way of punishing for Showalter's greed, but of course, Showalter said, no, thank you, maybe next time, but not today. So he goes queen d6. No more tricks on the queen. We've got to defend it. Now, a lot of times we tend to shuffle our rooks back and forth, but the better you get at chess, you realize it's not going to improve your position. So here Pillsbury goes knight d1, which looks very passive, but it defends the e-pawn for an eternity and after. There's no way you can attack that pawn unless Showalter somehow shows up with this long-range maneuver, which will take time and is unlikely to happen in the close future. Goes knight g6. Knight g6 obviously sets up some neat little tactics, and Pillsbury, who has been very diligent with his tactical tricks himself, is not going to fall for one. g3, h5. So we now get into a situation where we want to get and put some pressure on Showalter's pawns. And that is critical in all types of endgames you're looking at. Basic rook endgames, heavy piece rook endgames like this one. In both cases, that's the most important thing. Identifying the target and going after it. So first we just need to identify targets. Preferably not moving targets and pawns that might fall in the long run. It might not fall in like a couple of moves, like 2 or 3, but it may fall in like 5, 6. So which one of those pawns would be the ones we would go after? Yeah, d5. d5 is obviously the key weakness and the pawn that we would like to win the most, because if that falls, sadly there'll be another weakness on a6, and that'd be the end of the game. So d5, and the question is, should we go for the a pawn or should we go for the h pawn? Showalter's faced queen e2. Pillsbury saying, I'm going to attack your h-pawn, but that I wasn't really attacking. Really, I was after your d-pawn there, and later on, I might put pressure on the a6 one. Like, those are the clear two targets we have pieces around. Just like with the Miley Cyrus effect, generally, you can only go after pawns that are visible. Pawns that you only see in movies and shows, difficult to meet, difficult to reach. The D pawn, A pawn, clear targets, you can go after those. So H takes, knight f8. So here you've got to get Grandmaster moded. We decided which pawn we're attacking, we're going after it. Rook c5. So Pillsbury is going after the d pawn now. Rook d8, rook c1. Not only getting the control of the open c file, but strengthening his position as well. Now he could consider going rook a1, but there would be a little bit of discontinuation of the plan, like a little bit of a lack of congruence. Normally you want to go after the d pawn. If you go here, you're sort of mixing ideas. You should strictly be going one direction. Rook c1, g6, queen f3, knight e6. Alright, so this is a critical position again. Showalter is trying to shoo away our rook. How should we react? Well, clearly, we've got to do something about this threat. We'd definitely love to maneuver around, sure, but our rook is hanging. And yeah, it's good to be generous, but not on the chessboard. You can't be too generous. You may as well lose your queen in that case. You can go rook c6, you can go rook a5, pressing those pawns. But for the moment, we can sort of say that black has stabilized somewhat, right? Black has stabilized a little bit. Why did black stabilize? Well, black stabilized because white's pressure is nullified by the rook and queen. It's all guarded. There's nothing we can do about it so far. One of the ways of going and conquering a castle is to put it under siege. And that's exactly what Pillsbury does. He puts Showalter's defenses under siege. So he's trying to get rid of all of those defenders that have been overprotecting the d-pawn. So how did he do that? This is a critical moment. Don't feel shy if you feel you gotta pause and think about it. This is very important, and this marks the big difference between even grandmasters and legends. You may play moves such as rook c6, rook a5, and they're definitely decent moves. But rook c8 is a whole different universe. He is undermining Showalter's defenses, and that is more important. So rook c8 is the move played by Pillsbury. King g7, rook takes, knight takes, rook c5. And now everything is collapsing. You can't really go rook d7. I go knight c3 and I win the d-pawn. And that is all because your d8 rook is gone. I could bring this other rook in, bring this knight in, and now I'm winning. Even if we go back a little bit, just notice there was some pressure on the e-pawn. You really didn't have a chance to maneuver around. But after this trade, knight e6 was played, but after this trade, knight c3 could happen, and you have direct control over that square. So, in desperation, Showalter plays knight e6. Now, when we say desperado, it does not necessarily mean it's a bad move. In fact, it is probably the best practical chance that he could use. He's saying, okay, you may as well win the pawn, but at least your pieces will get a little bit jumbled up. Takes with the queen. You can't take the rook because I take your queen. Queen b6. Rook c1, queen b4. And Showalter does what you see in plenty of Carlsbad games and by other very tenacious defenders. He's trying to muddy waters. He's trying to lurk around his opponent's king. So what White needs to do is to consolidate the situation, make sure nothing funky happens. How can White consolidate here? So right now, your king really doesn't have too many guardian pawns sheltering your king. And if you don't have guardian pawns, well, then the other bodyguards have to do what they have to do. They've got to step it up. They have to substitute these defenders. Usually you have f2 and g3 pawns shielding the king. But right now, they're not around. Pawns don't move backwards, as we know. Knight f2. Very good. Knight f2 not only provides shield for the king if it ever wants to go up to g2, it also covers up this square on e1, so black can never go queen e1 check, which was a big threat earlier. Like this was a big threat to deal with. So knight f2. Now here Showalter makes a mistake, but it's a mistake that is reasonable. He thinks that he is going to win something. It's a double attack, which 90% of the time does win you some material. Not in this case, so we hit the 10% territory. Now, queen d2, again, falls smack into a typical tactic by Pillsbury. So even though we're looking at heavy weight and heavy piece endgames, you can notice that there's still plenty of tactics involved. So let's try to find what Pillsbury did in this scenario. And let's try to get a bit deeper than just considering one move. Let's calculate. It is always about sequence of moves. Now, I don't expect everyone to go 3-4 moves deep, but at least 2 moves deep is a ballpark of having an idea of a position. When you're saying, oh, I'd like to play here, you don't really have a continuation of follow-up. That means you still have to work on calculating skills. So right now, we are being double attacked by that queen. So we can do 2 things. We can try to defend both at the same time, or try to counterattack our opponent's king on g7. And notice something peculiar. The queen and anything that's on f6 is in a knight distance. Exact knight distance. Say what you will, but that seems like what we're looking for. It's just 1 knight distance away. So queen e5, f6, and here Pillsbury does not miss a chance like this. Queen takes f6, that is correct. King takes knight e4 check. And who said that you can't do tactics in the endgame? King f5, knight takes d2, g5, d5, takes, knight takes f4, e takes, king takes f4. Still a desperado. Here, Pillsbury plays rook c5, which is inaccurate. So this is by no means a perfect game. If Showalter would have played king e5, the king could come back, and if you go knight c4, there's king d4, and suddenly it's drawn. So if you move here, I take on d5. However, he was winning. Here he could have gone rook d1, obviously putting the rook behind the pawn and supporting the pawn push. If you go king e5, there is no way to cross over from d4 to c5. The pawn is defended and the pawn is going to march down the board. But Showalter misses this last chance. But now Pillsbury is accurate, plays knight c4, takes away that square. King e4, d6, and now it's too late, because after king d4 there's rook c7. You can't really capture because the pawn is going to promote now. So rook c7, rook d8, d7, and this runs into rook c8, where black resigned, because if you take, there's knight b6 check. Fittingly, another counter-attacking move by the knight, just attacking both the king and the rook, and therefore Showalter resigned. So a very interesting game by Pillsbury, where he combined tactical ideas with positional ones, undermining the Carlsbad structure of Showalter, and then making sure his pawns won't fall due to these tactical tricks of rook fc1, ideally putting pressure on the queen, and then slowly undermining black's weaknesses on d5 and a6. So the other game I wanted to show is this game between Anatoly Karpov and Ljubomir Ljubojevic. Ljubomir Ljubojevic was a candidate. He was playing at the top of his game. Was very close also to qualify. But narrowly missed out on that chance. But unfortunately, this time he's facing the legendary Anatoly Karpov, who needs no introduction, a world champion, and quite a veteran, winning plenty of tournaments. Even later in his career in the 90s, he was very, very successful. So let's take a look. It's again your typical Carlsbad. Rook b1, knight e4. And what you need to learn when you're playing the Carlsbad with white, that trades are not necessarily your enemies, as the pawn structure will give you ample compensation and ample play to succeed. So you are just trying to undermine black's position, and that is very much crucial. So takes, b4, a6, a4. This is your typical minority attack, bishop f5. Now, just because we looked at the Pillsbury game, I'm very curious if you can guess Karpov's very next move. You will not be surprised. It goes knight e5, obviously. So there were times people did not know who Pillsbury was, but with Karpov, you could be sure he knows the ideas and those little information that you need to become one of the best players. He has a very, very good positional style, and he has a good sense for nuances. Now, trades wouldn't actually help Yuboyevic, because you still would be facing off ideas such as b5, and then you will have to defend tenaciously. So instead, Yuboyevic goes rook d8, rook fc1, knight g6, bishop takes e4. So Karpov is not afraid of trading, and in general, trading isn't good for your position, but because of the specific nature of the Carlsbad structure, white actually gets winning chances by playing this way. Normally, if you have a better position, you want to keep as many pieces on the board or pawns on the board as you possibly can. Bishop takes e4, bishop takes e4, knight takes e4. And interestingly enough, black was doing more or less okay here, but does the impulsive move of d takes e4. If he would have done knight takes e5, his position would have been fairly balanced, maybe slightly worse, but not more than that. And again, that kind of shows how slippery positional chess can be. One single bad trade might just spell the end of your game. So d takes e4, a very logical decision, but a bit too impulsive by Yuboyevic, who is well known for his creative, aggressive play. D takes e4, knight takes, h takes, b5. Also notice that the idea I mentioned earlier in the Pillsbury game, c5 is not even on the agenda. I have all of my guys pressuring the c5 square. That's not going to happen. All right, so before we jump into this game deeply, let's just pinpoint potential targets in black's position. It's very important when you're playing more of a strategical game to identify the weaknesses in the position. Where are the potential targets here? Well, it is the b7 pawn. Obviously, we're going there and rolling down the board to get closer to the b pawn. That's why we have the rooks sort of ready to infiltrate and attack that pawn. And that's a great point. Apart from the b7 pawn, this e pawn is super duper weak. Now, this is one of those exceptions. This one the computers understand. But a lot of times, Humans are better at identifying that this e4 pawn is going to be a source of trouble. Karpov was extraordinarily good with that, realizing that yes, I have no ways of winning this pawn. It's doubly defended by the queen and rook. I'm not going to win it. I'm not going to win it in one move, not going to win it in two moves, not in 5, and not in 10. But on the 12th move, I am going to win it, and that's going to be the end of the game. So b5, cb, ab. Now, apart from realizing these weaknesses, white got an extra ace in the pocket, and that's the d pawn. Now, that wouldn't really be a big deal normally, but here it actually becomes a protected pass pawn, which can eventually make us stroll down to d8. Rook d6, b takes, b takes. And now we are at crossroads. Should we try to push our d pawns, try to undermine the e pawn, or maybe pester the a pawn? Now, I think Karpov used a bit of logic with his next move. The good thing for white is that any move you make is probably reasonable. It doesn't necessarily have to be accurate. It's still going to be okay because your pawn structure is so superior to black's. However, Karpov's next move is logical as it just involves another piece that wasn't to its fullest of potentials. White has these rooks controlling the b and c files, but his queen on c2 isn't particularly doing too much. So we went for queen a4, with the idea of putting pressure on the a pawn and a little bit pressing on e8. As I said, plenty of other moves are good, but queen a4 just looks right as it opens up new agendas for all of white's pieces. Queen d7. Queen takes d7, rook takes d7. Now, oftentimes we make the mistake of continuing our plans like nothing happened after a trade. Now, that would be a big mistake. Here, white should realize that with the queens off the board, the situation has completely shifted. We got to reassess our plans and come up with a new one. And because of the nature of the position, you could even just strategize. It's not always about moves, but about plans and ideas. Sort of putting pieces, pawns under siege. And if that works, you're probably going to dominate. So Karpov goes rook c5, stopping any pawn pushes. And again anticipates that this rook might be useful attacking the e pawn. So notice that Karpov's moves never serve only a single purpose. They always serve multiple purposes. Now see the question, what about going f3, undermining the e pawn? But then you would be trading away Yuboyevic's biggest weakness. He'd be so happy to give that e-pawn for another pawn. But that is the source of your advantage. If you trade it off, if you trade your opponent's weaknesses off, your advantage will be gone in a jiffy. So rook a7, doing the classical endgame play. Karpov goes, no, you are not going anywhere with that a-pawn. King f8. And now he gangs up on the a6 pawn. Can black play f5? We're going to talk about it in a bit. It is definitely a move to consider. Rook ea8. Okay. So far, Karpov's play was very successful. He has everything under wraps. Those rooks on the a file look fairly sad. They can't move. They literally can't move. but a position isn't winning. So our job in this position is to create a second plan, or a second front, if you will, to win this game. So let's try to find it. So we talked about the a-pawn being a target. But is there anything else we could try to go after? Is there any other weaknesses we can go after? Now, you could bring the king. And in endgames, that's not a bad plan. However, if you go this direction of king f1, king e2, king d2, it takes months to get to your destination. Enter Karpov's h4. And I'm not sure that Karpov was a big fan of Jimi Hendrix, but he is definitely crawling out his window just to take the e-pawn. And yes, usually you go king f1, e2, but in this case, it's just way more beneficial to just find an easier shortcut towards the e-pawn. Now, f5 never really works, because that would just drop the g6 pawn. And then it will drop the f5 pawn. And with all these pawns dropping, the closer you get to a lost endgame. So h4, king e7, king h2, on track to e4, king g3, king c7, rook b2. Again, notice, it's not what Karpov wants to do, but what Yuboyevic shouldn't be able to do. So it's making sure the king can't actually activate the rook. So if the king could get to b7, maybe you could activate the rook. But Karpov is no game for that. Rook b7, rook c5 check, king b8. Karpov knows you have the advantage. You are having everything under control. You go rook a2, and now you don't trade. Because these pieces are very passive, and just having a pass pawn isn't going to win you a game. So rook e7, king f4. So our big plan is coming to fruition. King b7, rook b2, here, rook c6. Just twisting another one on black's position. Black is still hopelessly tied up. It's not just that white is better, but black just practically has no moves. Rook h8, and as the rook moves away, he takes this chance to win this pawn. a5, takes. King b7, rook a6. Rook takes h4, king g3. And again, you might be saying, hey, Yuboyevic won a pawn. Well, that is true, but is Karpov under control, like having the position under control? Totally. All of Ljubomir Ljubojevic's pieces are tied up. And in fact, is completely lost by this moment. King c6, a splendid tactical spot by the black player and black grandmaster. You can't take any of them. You're going to lose one of those. But Karpov is very good at calculating. Maybe it's not what he's known for, but if it comes down to pure calculation, he is up top at that time. So check, king b5, and now he trades king h2, just goes back, job is done. You are going to go full Pac-Man mode on the g and f pawns. King takes a6, rook takes f7, and it is game over. So quite a nice game by Anatoly Karpov, showing that in the long run, you always want to latch on your opponent's weaknesses And once they're tied up, you don't ever want to let it go. Thank you so much for watching, and hope you learned a bit about how to deal with the Carlsbad endgames. Goodbye.